Boots slammed into frozen mud as tracer fire ripped across the tree line. Metal screamed. Radios crackled. Someone was shouting orders that no one could hear anymore. A group of German women, uniformed, armed just moments ago, were being herded forward under Allied rifles. Their breath came out in sharp white bursts. Hands raised. Faces smeared with oil, ash, and fear. Then something strange happened. As the first woman reached the clearing, she stopped. Not from fear. Not from injury. She turned her head slightly, as if listening. Behind her, the others did the same. No screams. No resistance. No pleading. Just silence. An Allied sergeant barked, "Move." No one moved. And that's when the rule was noticed. Not one of the captured women would sit down. Not on the ground. Not on a crate. Not even when ordered. They stood. For hours. And none of them explained why. Because they couldn't or wouldn't. And by morning, one of them was gone. Western Europe. Winter 1944, the war was supposed to be nearing its end, at least on paper. Allied forces were advancing fast. German lines were collapsing. Surrenders were increasing daily. But something new had appeared in intelligence reports. Female German personnel operating close to active fronts. Not nurses. Not clerks. Radio operators. Couriers. Recon specialists. Women trained not to fight, but to vanish. Their job was simple. Carry information no radio should transmit. Move through destroyed zones unnoticed. Disappear if capture was imminent. By late December, several of these women had been taken alive. And almost immediately, Allied officers noticed patterns. No shared surnames. No unit numbers that matched records. In one disturbing behavior, every captured woman followed the same silent rule. Never sit. Never rest. Never touch the ground. Doctors assumed shock. Interrogators assumed defiance. But intelligence analysts weren't convinced. Because this rule appeared only after capture, and no one could explain what would happen. If they broke it, the first indication that something was wrong, did not come from the prisoners themselves. It came from the radios late that night, a temporary Allied command post set up inside a half-destroyed farmhouse. A signals officer noticed an anomaly on a shared frequency. It wasn't strong enough to be a transmission, and it wasn't random enough to be static. It pulsed, briefly, deliberately, just long enough to be recorded before vanishing again. At first, it was dismissed as interference, damaged equipment, atmospheric distortion. A stray reflection from enemy gear still operating in the area, but when the signal appeared a second time, analysts paid attention. The cadence was wrong. Too structured. Too intentional. When the fragment was finally decoded, it stunned everyone in the room. 6 words. No call sign. No origin point. No encryption pattern that matched German or Allied systems. Standing means she is still safe. The room went silent. Officers stared at the transcription, unsure whether they were looking at a mistranslation or a provocation. No one could explain who she was supposed to be. No one could explain why standing mattered. And no one could explain how a message like that could appear on a frequency both sides. Believed was secure. Less than an hour later, a second signal broke through, shorter, clearer, more urgent. If she sits, extraction is impossible. That word extraction changed everything. This wasn't a battlefield message. It wasn't tactical. It wasn't psychological warfare. It sounded like a status update, as if someone, somewhere, was monitoring the prisoners in real time. Command ordered an immediate review of all POW handling since the women had been captured. Guards were questioned. Logs were checked. Film footage, originally taken for documentation, was pulled and examined frame by frame. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore, whenever exhaustion took hold. The women shifted closer together. Whenever one of them swayed or bent her knees, another would reach out and steady her. Hands clasped arms. Fingers dug into fabric. Silent coordination, practiced and automatic. Not once did any of them allow a body to touch the ground. Not once did they ask why they were being held, and not once did they speak to each other, except with their eyes at 2:17 a.m. The anomaly became reality. An American guard stationed near the perimeter radioed, and his voice tight, confused, and low. "Sir, the third prisoner. She's not here anymore." No alarms had been triggered. No gunshots were heard. No shadows had crossed the floodlights. The woman had been standing less than 10 feet from him. Moments earlier, all that remained were her boots. Still upright. Still aligned, as if she had stepped out of them, and nowhere at all. And in that moment, every officer listening understood the same terrifying truth. The messages hadn't been warnings. They had been instructions, and something had just followed them. Asterisk at first. No one admitted that anything extraordinary had happened. The disappearance was logged as a discrepancy, a counting error, a misunderstanding between guards during a shift change, a lapse in attention caused by exhaustion. Frontline units were under constant pressure. Men were tired. Mistakes happened, but this mistake refused to resolve itself. The perimeter was rechecked within minutes. Floodlights swept the clearing again and again, throwing long shadows across the mud and broken branches. Guards retraced their steps. Tracks were searched for. Nothing led away from where the woman had been standing. There were no signs of a struggle. No drag marks. No disturbed ground. It was as if she had never been there at all. The remaining prisoners were ordered to separate for questioning. They complied instantly. Each woman stepped precisely where she was told, careful not to lower herself. Careful not to let her boots linger too long in one place. They did not ask what had happened to the missing woman. They did not ask where she had gone. They already knew she wasn't coming back. Interrogations began at dawn. Each woman was questioned individually, sometimes with translators, sometimes without. Names were requested, units, assignments, routes, codes. The answers were minimal, rehearsed, and strangely incomplete. They denied knowing each other well, denied belonging to the same unit, denied any special training beyond communications and logistics. But when asked about the rule, about why they refused to sit, every woman gave the same response. Silence. Some lowered their eyes. Some stared past the interrogator. One closed her eyes entirely, as if bracing herself. Medical officers were brought in next. They examined circulation, balance, signs of trauma. Several women were visibly exhausted. Swaying slightly when forced to remain upright for extended periods, one collapsed. She did not fall. She was caught by two others before her knees touched the ground. They lifted her with surprising strength, their faces expressionless, movements perfectly coordinated. When a doctor attempted to intervene, ordering them to let the woman rest, they ignored him completely. The unconscious prisoner was carried, not laid down, but propped against a wall. Feet still planted, body supported just enough to keep her vertical. When she regained consciousness, the first thing she did was straighten. Herself, that was the moment several officers stopped seeing defiance and started seeing fear. Orders began to fragment. DOT-1 command instructed guards to force compliance, insisting that the behavior was a psychological tactic meant to intimidate captors. Another issued the opposite directive, warning that provoking the prisoners could trigger unknown consequences. A third suggested immediate transfer to rear facilities. Far from the front, none of those orders explained the radios. Signals interference increased as the day wore on. Not full transmissions. Fragments. Bursts of static that appeared and vanished within seconds. Enough to disrupt communications. Enough to unsettle experienced. Operators thought the interference always occurred. Shortly after, one of the women showed signs of fatigue and always stopped when she recovered her stance. Analysts began cross-referencing. Time stomps, disappearances, interference, prisoner, movement. The alignment was impossible to ignore. Late that evening, an Allied intelligence officer ordered a full review of earlier captures involving German female personnel. Old files were reopened. Testimonies reread. Footage re-examined, patterns emerged retroactively, asterisk. Reports of women who refused to rest. Mentions of guards unnerved by. Prisoners who watched the ground, single dismissed note. Describing boots found standing upright after an air raid. None of it had seemed important at the time. Now it felt like a warning missed. The prisoners were moved to a more secure holding area. An improvised camp reinforced with additional lighting and round-the-clock guards. They were instructed to remain standing until further notice. They obeyed without complaint. Hours passed, then something worse happened. Another woman vanished. This time, there were witnesses. She had been standing between two others, her shoulder brushing one arm, her sleeve touching the other. A guard had looked away for no more than a few seconds, long enough to answer a radio call. When he looked back, there was empty space. The two women beside her did not move, did not react. They simply closed the gap. No sound, no disturbance, no explanation. Panic finally reached command. Guards were doubled. Weapons were loaded. Orders were shouted more than spoken. No one slept, and still. The women stood. Some began to whisper that the prisoners weren't waiting to escape. They were waiting to be taken, by what no one could say. But as night fell, and the radios crackled once again with unexplained signals, one thing became clear to everyone involved. Whatever was happening was not under its allied control, and whatever rule the women were following. It wasn't meant to protect them from guards. It was meant to protect them from something else, something that was listening and getting closer. Asterisk by the second week of January 1945. The situation had crossed a line that no officer wanted to name aloud. The disappearances were no longer isolated incidents. They were now events, anticipated, feared, and quietly prepared for. Every guard on duty knew the pattern. Every signals officer waited for the interference. Every commander understood that once it began, there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The remaining women were transferred to a reinforced holding site farther from the front. The location was chosen deliberately. Solid structures, concrete floors, limited access points, controlled lighting, no forests. No open ground. No darkness where someone could claim they missed something. The logic was simple. If the disappearances continued here, there would be no explanation left except the impossible. The women arrived at dusk. They were thinner now. Faces drawn. Movements slower. But the rule remained absolute. Each woman stepped off the transport and stood exactly where directed, spacing themselves with quiet precision. They did not speak. They did not look at one another. They did not look at the guards. Instead, every one of them glanced briefly downward, as if confirming something. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. One woman's breathing became shallow. Another trembled slightly in her legs. A medic suggested sedation. Command refused. No one was willing to risk what might happen if a woman lost consciousness while standing, or worse. Collapsed radio operators inside the facility reported intermittent disruptions almost immediately. Not static. Not feedback. Something else. A faint, repeating signal that came and went in short bursts. Always at irregular intervals. Always strongest near the prisoners. Analysts attempted to triangulate the source. There was none. The signal did not behave like a broadcast. It did not weaken with distance. It did not strengthen when equipment was adjusted. It behaved more like a response, something activating briefly, then shutting down. Shortly after midnight, the first crisis began. One of the women faltered. It was subtle at first, a shift of weight, a slight bend in the knees. The two women nearest her reacted instantly, gripping her arms. Pulling her upright with practiced force, a guard stepped forward instinctively. Before he could speak, the lights flickered. Just once. The radio. Equipment came alive. Not with words, with a tone low, sustained, almost like a breath held too long. Every man in the room froze, The tone stopped. The woman was still standing. For several minutes, no one moved. That was when command made the decision that would later be buried under layers of classification. They would force an answer. A senior Allied intelligence officer arrived shortly before dawn. He had reviewed every report, every recording, every contradictory order. He had dismissed superstition his entire career. He was not about to start now. He authorized a controlled observation, not officially an interrogation, not officially an experiment. An observation, one woman would be isolated. One space. Full surveillance. If nothing happened, the mystery would end. If something did happen, there would be witnesses. The woman selected was younger than the others, perhaps in her mid-20s. She had shown no signs of panic since capture. No emotional outbursts. No resistance. She had followed the rule perfectly. She was escorted into a converted storage room beneath the facility. Thick concrete walls. One overhead light. No windows. A single wooden chair placed deliberately in the center of the room. Recording equipment was set up in the corner. Radios tuned across multiple frequencies, all running continuously. Guards took positions. Inside and outside the room, the door was sealed. She was guided to the center. She stood. Minutes passed, then an hour. She did not shift her stance, did not glance at the chair, did not look at the guards. Her eyes remained fixed slightly downward, not at the floor itself, but as if watching for movement beneath it. The officer ordered her to sit. She did not respond. The order was repeated. Louder. She shook her head once. Slowly, when told she would be forced. Something changed. Her composure cracked, not into fear, but urgency. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes widened just enough to register alarm. She spoke. Only one sentence. "You're early." No one understood what she meant. The guards moved in. Hands took her arms. They guided her toward the chair. The moment her body touched it, the overhead light flickered violently. The radios activated. On their own, not static, a voice, female, distorted, calm, you've moved her too early. The woman screamed. Not from pain, from recognition. Her hands slammed against the floor, fingers clawing at the concrete as if something beneath it had suddenly answered back. The guards tried to pull her up, but her body resisted in a way that made no physical sense. Not heavy, not rigid, but sliding. As if the surface itself were no longer solid. The tone returned, louder this time, then silence. The woman was gone. No explosion. No flash, no trace. The chair remained in place, still warm. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the recording equipment failed all at once. Within the hour, every witness in the facility signed silence agreements. The recordings were removed. The room was sealed. The operation was terminated and reclassified because what terrified command was not what they had seen. It was what they finally understood, standing. Had never been resistance. It had been timing. And they had forced her to miss the window. Asterisk, the facility was evacuated. Before sunrise, no explanation was given to the enlisted men. They were told only that the site was no longer operational and that all materials inside were to be sealed and transferred. Under armed escort, the room where the woman had vanished was locked, then locked again, then marked with a classification level that ensured no one below senior command would ever open it. The remaining women were gone by noon, not executed, not transferred to another camp, simply reassigned. That was the word used in the paperwork. Their status was listed as transferred. Further disposition pending, no destination. Was named, no transport logs were attached, no receiving unit. Acknowledged custody by the time the war ended. Every reference to the incident had been fragmented across multiple archives, each file incomplete on its own, each dependent on another document that no longer appeared to exist. Official histories made no mention of female POW disappearances. Trials recorded none. Grave registries listed none. Veterans' memoirs avoided the subject entirely except in fragments years later. During a routine declassification review, a junior archivist stumbled upon a mislabeled box. Inside were personal effects recovered from German communications personnel notebooks. Ration cards, fragments of letters never sent. One item stood out: a small diary, written in tight, deliberate handwriting. The author was identified only by rank and assignment, a female signals officer attached to a mobile intelligence unit. The entries were mundane at first: weather, locations, equipment failures. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted. She wrote about standing drills, about timing, about listening. The final entry was dated just days before her reported capture. Asterisk, it read: "If we are taken, you must not sit. Not until the window closes. Standing keeps us aligned. The ground remembers." There was no further explanation. Historians who later reviewed the diary dismissed it as stress-induced. Metaphor language shaped by exhaustion, fear, and the psychological strain of a collapsing war. The phrase "the ground remembers" was cited as symbolic, poetic, meaningless. But not everyone agreed. In the 1970s, a handful of Allied veterans agreed to be interviewed off the record. They had never spoken publicly about the events, and none of them used the same words, yet their descriptions matched. They remembered the silence. They remembered the way the women stood, not rigid, not defiant, but attentive. They remembered how the prisoners watched the floor as if it were a clock. Asterisk. One former guard described the feeling as being late for something you didn't understand. Another recalled that after the disappearances, radios would briefly activate on their own, even months later. Always at the same hour of night, always briefly, always without voices. One intelligence officer, interviewed near the end of his life, admitted something that never appeared in any report. He said the term extraction had not been chosen by analysts. It had appeared unprompted in the original signal logs: no sender, no origin, no explanation. And the phrase extraction window appeared multiple times in classified summaries, always followed by the same annotation: missed. To this day, that file remains sealed. No official reason is given, but among those who know it exists, there is a quiet understanding. Whatever those women were trained for did not end with capture. Standing was not superstition. It was not resistance. It was synchronization. They were not waiting to escape. They were waiting to be collected. And sometimes, when conditions were right, something came. Something that did not leave footprints. Something that did not need doors. Something that operated on rules older than the war itself. The women who vanished were never found, but in archived radio logs, buried deep among routine transmissions. There are moments of unexplained activation, brief, directionless, meaningless to anyone listening casually, except for one detail. They occur only in places where women once stood, and if you listen closely enough, long enough, it almost sounds like confirmation, not a message, not a warning, just a signal that something somewhere has finally closed the window and does not intend to open it again.